Hey, welcome back to Sleepy Old World. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up your blanket, find that comfortable spot you've been saving for exactly this kind of evening, and just let yourself settle for a moment. There's no rush, nowhere you have to be, nothing that needs deciding or remembering or fixing until tomorrow, and tomorrow's a long way off from here. Tonight we're going somewhere that moves, which is a funny thing to say for a sleep video, I know. But stay with me, because there is a very specific kind of sleep that is different from all other kinds, and if you've ever experienced it, you know exactly what I mean. It's the sleep you fall into on a long journey, the kind where the world outside the window is doing all the work and your body finally accepts that there is nothing left for you to do except let go. The motion does it. The sound does it. The sense of being carried somewhere by something larger than yourself does it. And something in the deep animal part of your brain, something very old and very quiet, decides that this is safe, this is allowed. You can rest now. We're going to spend tonight on a Victorian train, not the high-speed variety, not the sleek climate-controlled business-like trains of later decades. We're going on the real thing, the original thing, iron and steam and coal smoke and the smell of leather, wood polish, and the particular damp warmth of a carriage that's been breathing the breath of passengers all day. We're going somewhere in England, somewhere in the 1880s, on a journey that will take most of the evening, through countryside that unfolds outside your window like something from a painting, past villages with lit windows and church spires going dark against a grey sky, through tunnels where everything goes black and the sound changes into something almost oceanic, and then back out again into the long, slow, golden slant of late afternoon light settling into dusk. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Let the fan run if you like that kind of white noise behind things. Get very horizontal. And let me take you to a railway platform in England in the year 1882. It's late afternoon, maybe 3 o'clock, maybe past. The particular time of year where the light is already thinking about leaving, already beginning that long autumn tilt toward dark but hasn't committed yet. The station is a medium-sized one, not a great terminus like Paddington or Victoria, with their enormous iron and glass cathedral roofs and the roar of dozens of trains arriving and departing simultaneously. This is a county station, a station with a name that sounds like a place, Marlworth Junction, let's say, or Ashfield, or something with a ford or a wick or a bridge at the end of it. A station that smells of coal smoke and something sweet that might be the bakery across the road. The platform is made of stone, and your footsteps sound different on it than on pavement. Lower, more certain somehow. There are flower baskets hanging from iron brackets along the platform edge, the last of the summer flowers still gamely holding on, a little ragged now at the edges but still there, still trying. A porter moves along the platform with the particular unhurried purpose of someone who has done the same walk thousands of times and knows exactly where everything is without looking. He's wearing a uniform the colour of dark wool in winter, and he touches the brim of his cap at you as he passes, not quite looking, just acknowledging. You have your ticket. It is a proper Victorian railway ticket, small and stiff, printed in ink that looks almost purple, with the station name and the class and the date stamped into it. First class, because tonight we are travelling in comfort, not because Victorian first-class travel was particularly luxurious by modern standards. It was warm and padded, which was more than could be said for third class, where the seats were wooden benches and the carriages were open to the elements until the Regulation of Railways Act put a stop to that in 1844, though the improvements came slowly and unevenly. But first class in 1882 means a compartment, a private world within the world of the train. You step up onto the train. The step is higher than you expect, as it always is, and there's a little iron handle to grip, painted black, worn to brightness where thousands of hands have gripped it before yours. The carriage corridor is narrow and smells of leather and something warm, faintly oily, a machine smell underlaid with the sweet rot of damp wood and something floral from a lady who passed through here earlier. The corridor is panelled in dark wood, mahogany maybe, or something aspiring to it. The light fixtures are small glass globes with gas jets inside, though on some lines they've started fitting electric light now, which flickers slightly and seems not quite trustworthy. Tonight the gaslight is better, warmer, more honest about what it is. You find your compartment. The number is painted in gold on a small oval panel beside the door. You slide the door across. It moves on a brass runner and makes a satisfying mechanical sound, the kind of sound that only well-maintained Victorian machinery makes, a sound that has intention in it, and then you are inside. The compartment is small. That is the first thing. 6 people can travel in a first-class Victorian railway compartment, 3 facing 3, and it is intimate in a way that people today might find startling. The seats run the full width of the carriage on both sides, upholstered in deep buttoned velvet. The colour depends on the railway company. Some favoured crimson, some a dark plum, some a tobacco brown that has absorbed several decades of pipe smoke and is now really its own colour, uncategorizable and strangely appealing. Your seat is the window seat, which is the best seat, the one you always chose when you were given the option, because the window is what this is about. The window is large by the standards of what came before. Before trains, windows in motion barely existed as a concept, since coaches moved slowly enough that the view was something you stepped out to see rather than something that scrolled past you. Here the window is substantial, divided by a thin frame of brass into upper and lower sections, the upper of which opens on a leather strap, the lower sealed against draughts. The glass is slightly imperfect in the way that Victorian glass sometimes was, with a faint waviness to it, a slight distortion that gives the passing landscape a quality that is almost, not quite, but almost, like looking at a painting of landscape rather than the landscape itself. You settle into your seat. The velvet is deep and gives under you and then holds. There is a small luggage rack overhead, brass rods and woven cording, and you've put your bag up there, and the overhead weight of it is somehow reassuring. Your coat is folded beside you. The compartment smells of itself, which is to say warmth and upholstery, and the very faint ghost of coal smoke that has worked its way through every seal and join of the carriage, despite the best efforts of the ventilation. The train has not yet moved, for now you are sitting in a stationary carriage in a county station, watching the platform through your slightly imperfect window, and there is a particular quality to this moment that I want to try to describe because I think it's something that modern travellers have largely lost. The quality of the interval before departure, before you had a phone in your pocket, before you had anything to do in a moment of waiting other than wait. There was nothing to do in this compartment but be present in it. You might look out the window, you might read a newspaper, a novel, a journal, or you might do nothing at all, just sit, breathing the warm air of the carriage, letting your attention drift unfocused across the platform, and in that unfocused attention, things become oddly clear. The flower basket, the porter, the woman on the platform who is saying goodbye to someone, her face doing that complicated thing that faces do when they are trying not to show what they are feeling, a small dog on a lead interested in everything, A boy in a school cap, running for reasons that are entirely his own. A newspaper seller whose voice carries a particular professional rise and fall that's almost musical. Steam from somewhere, not from your train but from another platform, drifting sideways in the cold air. You're watching all of this with the particular calm of someone who has accepted that they are here now in this compartment, and the journey will begin when it begins, and until then the station is the whole world. Then comes the sound. It begins far down the platform, a kind of general gathering of noise, a clearing of collective throat, a series of mechanical sounds from the direction of the locomotive that you cannot see from your compartment but can feel the meaning of. A whistle, not the long two-note blast of departure, that's still coming, but a shorter sound, a check-in, a preparation. Then a hiss that you feel as much as hear, steam under pressure finding its way through the joints of something enormous, a shudder, the faintest movement, more imagined than felt, that is the train announcing to itself that this is about to happen. Then the whistle, long and low and utterly certain, and the train begins to move. It starts with a jerk, not violent, not alarming, but definite, the unmistakable bodily shock of something large beginning to resist inertia and then overcome it. The platform slides backward past your window, the flower baskets go, the porter goes, the woman and her complicated face go, the platform edge, the station building with its Victorian Gothic roofline and its hanging clock, all of it goes, and then you are in the world of motion, and the world of motion is entirely different from any other world. This is what I want to stay with for a while, because I think it's the heart of what we're here to explore tonight. Not the history of Victorian railways, though we'll spend time with that, or the social world of the Victorian railway compartment, though that's rich and strange and fascinating, but the experience itself, what it felt like in your body and your mind to be carried through the English countryside in 1882 at speeds that no human being before roughly 1830 had ever experienced. The speed of a Victorian express train could reach 60 miles an hour on a good stretch of line. In 1882, this is fast. Faster than anything that moves on land except a very alarmed horse in a very specific set of circumstances. The countryside rushes past your window at a rate that is, still, in this era, genuinely surprising. Not yet ordinary, not yet the background noise of modern life that you pass through without noticing. People were still in the process in 1882 of adjusting to what speed actually felt like as a constant condition. There's something in the early literature of rail travel that captures this adjustment. Writers of the 1840s and 1850s, the first generation of people who travelled regularly by train, kept reaching for comparisons and finding them inadequate, like flying, like dreaming, like being inside a river. The landscape doesn't look the same from 60 miles an hour as it does from a horse-drawn coach at 12. From a coach you see detail, individual stones in a wall, the expression on a face in a doorway, the colour of a specific flower. From a train the foreground blurs and what comes into clarity is the middle distance, the shape of a hillside, the sweep of a valley, the arrangement of trees against a sky. It's a different way of seeing. It produces a different relationship with space. You are in that relationship now. Outside your window the world is doing its thing. The station has gone completely, and what you have instead is the outskirts of the town, terraced houses backing onto the railway, their gardens pressed up against the line, a shed, a washing line with sheets moving in the train's passage, a cat sitting on a fence watching the train go by with the absolute professional disinterest of a cat that has watched this train go by many times and has never once found it interesting. Then the houses thin and fall away, and you're in what the Victorians would call the country, though it's the managed agricultural English countryside rather than wilderness. Ploughed fields in brown corduroy, hedgerows dense with the last of autumn, sheep on a hillside moving with the collective drift of a slow thought. A church spire, gone before you've finished registering it. The particular quality of light on a field where the sun has gone behind a cloud and then come back, so that the field seems to lift slightly to offer itself to the light. A canal running briefly alongside the railway, its dark water reflecting grey sky. A barge moving in the opposite direction so slowly it seems painted onto the water. Gone. All of it gone as quickly as it came. And this is part of the pleasure, you understand. Not just the seeing, but the losing. Each view arrives complete and is taken away before you can do anything with it. You can't analyze the hillside. You can't find the church spire again. You can't stop and look more closely at that field. The train is moving and the world is moving past, and you are simply a witness to the fact of it. There's a release in that, a permission. You don't have to do anything with what you see, you just see it. And then the next thing arrives. The rhythm of the wheels on the rail joins begins now, properly. Not a steady sound, the track is not perfectly smooth, the joins not perfectly even, but something with pulse in it, a repeating pattern that isn't quite regular enough to become boring. Da-dum, and then a variation, da-da-dum, and then back, and the carriage sways gently in a motion that is not alarming but is definitely present, a side-to-side quality like being rocked, like being, if you let yourself follow the metaphor, in a cradle, or on a boat on gentle water, or in the arms of something larger than yourself that knows where it's going and doesn't need your help to get there. You feel this in your spine first, then in your shoulders, then slowly in your jaw, which unclenches without your noticing it happening. Let me tell you about the other people who might share your compartment tonight, because in the Victorian railway world, the compartment is everything. It's your society for the duration of the journey. If you travel alone, you have it to yourself, which is either a gift or a loneliness depending on your mood. If you travel with strangers, there is an entire elaborate social code governing what happens, and understanding that code is part of understanding the world we're in. The first-class compartment in 1882 holds, as I said, 6 passengers, 3 on each side facing each other. If you imagine sitting knee almost to knee with 2 strangers on your right, 2 strangers across from you and 1 stranger to your left, you begin to understand the particular social pressure this creates. The Victorians were exquisitely attuned to social pressure of exactly this kind. They had evolved over decades of railway travel a set of unspoken rules for the compartment that were understood by anyone who travelled regularly, even though they were never written down. You did not look directly at your fellow passengers for extended periods. You looked at the window, at your book, at a careful midpoint on the far wall. You did not initiate conversation. You might nod on first entering, a brief acknowledgement of shared space, but the nod closed as many doors as it opened. You did not eat in a way that was audible. You did not occupy more than your portion of the shared armrest. If someone clearly wished to sleep, you treated their sleep as a private matter that required no comment or accommodation beyond simply not disturbing them. These rules were so well understood and so thoroughly enforced by collective social pressure that transgressing them, striking up an unsolicited conversation, for instance, or eating something pungent and fragrant, or monopolizing the window side, could make you a figure of mild but lasting judgment. Passengers who broke the codes of the railway compartment were discussed Afterward, in the way people discuss anyone who doesn't understand the rules of a space they've entered. Dickens wrote about this. He hated strangers in railway compartments. Or more precisely, he hated strangers who didn't understand that he didn't want to talk. He wrote to a friend once that he had nearly made his escape from a compartment before a terrible talker climbed in at the last moment and captured him for 2 solid hours. There's something both amusing and deeply recognizable about that. The particular horror of the unwanted companion in an enclosed space. The Victorian railway gave this horror its definitive form. But there's another side to this. The compartment, with its rules of mutual non-engagement, its social fiction that 6 people in an enclosed space are somehow not occupying the same room, also created a strange kind of intimacy. You were physically close to these people for hours. You could hear them breathe. If they slept, you saw the private faces that people wear when they sleep, unguarded, softened, nothing like the careful expressions they'd worn when they got on. You noticed things, the quality of their coat, the slight irregularity in one man's breathing that suggested a cold coming on, the way the woman across from you held her book without quite reading it, turning a page every now and then but with her eyes going somewhere else. You learned people, not their names or their stories, but their textures, in the compressed intimacy of a 4-hour journey, and then they got off at their stop and were gone forever. There's a kind of relationship that only exists in transience. The railway gave it a setting. Let me tell you about the compartment tonight. It's just the 2 of us, if you're willing. No other passengers. We've gotten lucky, or perhaps it's a slower train, or perhaps the gods of this particular narration have arranged it, so that tonight we travel in the pleasant solitude of an unshared compartment, with the window and the velvet and the swaying and the sound of the wheels entirely to ourselves. Outside the window, the light is doing something. It's been doing something for a while now, while we were talking about other things, and I want to draw your attention back to it. The sun has moved to a lower angle. We're heading west, which means we're heading into the sun's withdrawal, watching it go. The light on the fields now has that very specific October quality, not warm exactly but gilded, turning ordinary brown earth a colour that would be expensive to name. The shadows of the trees are long and blue. A farmhouse on a slight rise catches the last horizontal rays and goes briefly, intensely amber, like something about to be extinguished. Then a tunnel. The tunnel deserves its own moment. Let me give it one. The approach to a tunnel on a Victorian railway is signalled by several things at once. The landscape changes. You enter a cut, a section where the engineers have driven the line through rock rather than around it, and the walls rise on either side and the sky narrows to a stripe. The sound changes, becomes more enclosed, gains an echo. The train's voice changes, louder, more present, filling the newly constrained space with itself. And then the darkness arrives, not gradually, suddenly. The tunnel mouth appears and you enter it and the window goes black. Not the muted dark of a cloudy night, which still has dimensionality and the suggestion of light somewhere beyond it. Pure black, no gradations, nothing. The window becomes a mirror, and in it you see your own compartment reflected back at you, the gas lamp, your own face, your coat folded beside you, floating in that perfect nothing, and the sound in the tunnel is something. The wheels on the rail, the hiss of steam somehow finding its way back through the train, the rattling of the window glass, a sharper version of the ordinary rattling, amplified by whatever the tunnel does to sound. The carriage breathes differently in a tunnel, slightly warmer, slightly closer. The coal smell becomes briefly more present. People had strong feelings about tunnels in the early days of rail travel. strong enough feelings that the railway companies occasionally felt the need to address them. Some passengers found tunnels deeply alarming. The sudden blindness, the enclosed roar, the pressure change. Some women reportedly held their faces in their hands. Some men gripped the seat. The early tunnel experiences were also occasionally complicated by the gas lighting of the early carriages, which would be extinguished by the draft of tunnel entry and leave passengers in complete darkness for minutes at a time until they could be relit, which required either a passenger producing a light or an attendant working their way through the train. By 1882, this is mostly sorted, or at least expected. You've been through tunnels, you know what they are. The blackness no longer alarms you. You lean your head back against the seat and let the sound have you for a while. Then the tunnel ends. Just as suddenly as it arrived, the light returns. Not sunlight anymore, we're past that now. The sun has set in the last few minutes while you were in the dark. But dusk light, the even grey blue of a sky that's let go of the sun but hasn't yet committed to night. The fields outside are grey-green. The hedgerows are dark. The farmhouses have lit their lamps and the windows are warm squares in the dimming world. You have been travelling for almost 2 hours. This is where something begins to happen in your body that has nothing to do with any decision you've made. It's the accumulated effect of the motion, the warmth, the sound, the visual rhythm of a landscape moving past. Your nervous system has been receiving these inputs steadily for 2 hours now, and it has done what nervous systems do with steady, non-threatening, slightly monotonous sensory input. It has begun to categorize it as safe, ordinary, not requiring response. And in the absence of required response, it begins to ease towards something lower, something that looks from the outside like sleepiness, and from the inside like a very pleasant kind of disappearance. Let me tell you something about Victorian sleep on trains, because it's an actual documented phenomenon that people wrote about and thought about in ways that I find genuinely interesting. The Victorians were, in many respects, more attentive to sleep than we are, not always more skilled at it. The Victorian bedroom had its own complications which we might come to another night, but more theoretically engaged with it. Sleep was a subject of medical interest, philosophical interest, social concern. The question of who slept where and how and when mattered in ways that reflected the broader social order, and the question of how the railway affected sleep was genuinely new, in the sense that no previous generation had had to think about it. Before trains, human beings travelled at speeds slow enough that sleep on the road was a relatively natural affair. In a coach, a stagecoach jolting along a rutted road at 8 or 10 miles an hour, you might doze in the corner if you were tired enough, but the experience was not particularly conducive to rest. Too cold, too bumpy, too unpredictable. Sleep happened at inns, in beds, at night, as it was supposed to. Travel was something you endured, not something you slept through. The train changed this. The speed, the enclosure, the warmth of a heated carriage. Because the Victorians did develop foot warmers and later carriage heating, and the particular rhythm of rail motion combined to produce something that travellers noticed and remarked upon almost immediately. You could sleep on a train, really sleep, not just doze. You could close your eyes and go somewhere and open them again and find that an hour had passed and you were 30 miles further along, and felt if not exactly rested, then at least not worse than before. Medical opinion was divided about whether this was good. Medical opinion in the Victorian era was divided about a great many things relating to the effects of railway travel on the human body, and some of the concerns now look somewhat funny from this distance. There was serious professional debate, for instance, about whether the high speeds of rail travel might cause the human body to come apart structurally, like a poorly made machine vibrated beyond its tolerances. This concern was engaged with seriously enough in the 1830s that it appeared in medical journals. It did not obviously prove correct, but it illustrates the degree to which the technology was outrunning the available frameworks for understanding it. More lasting was the concern about what became known as railway spine, a vague and somewhat contested diagnosis describing the neurological and physiological damage allegedly caused by sustained exposure to railway vibration. The condition was real enough to generate a medical literature, a legal industry, railway companies were sued over it, and a sustained public conversation about what all this motion might be doing to the bodies subjected to it. Some physicians believed railway travel fatigued the nervous system in ways that ordinary travel did not. Some believed it aggravated existing conditions. Some believed it was, on balance, therapeutic for certain complaints, particularly complaints of the respiratory system, since the fresh air moving through a slightly open window was considered beneficial, and sleep on trains occupied an ambiguous position in all of this. On one hand, rest was obviously beneficial. Sleep restored. Anyone who had fallen asleep in a train and woken feeling more themselves could attest to that. On the other hand, the quality of railway sleep was debated. Did the motion prevent the deep restorative sleep that true rest required? Was there something about the constant vibration that kept the sleeper in a shallower state, the edges of sleep without the center of it? And then there was the social concern. Sleeping in a railway compartment made you vulnerable. You were unconscious in a space you shared with strangers. Your luggage was unguarded. Your valuables were accessible. Your face was exposed in the particular vulnerability of sleep. Guidebooks for railway travelers, a genre that developed with impressive speed once it became clear that large numbers of people were going to need guidance about this entirely new way of moving through the world, addressed the question of sleep with the same practical seriousness they applied to everything else. Some warned against it. Some offered advice about how to do it safely. Sit in a corner seat, which offered a wall to lean against. Secure your valuables inside your clothing rather than in a bag that could be opened without waking you. Travel in a ladies-only carriage if you were a woman traveling without a male companion, since the question of sleeping in mixed company raised its own etiquette complications. Ladies' carriages were themselves an interesting institution. They existed specifically because of the anxiety created by the compartment's intimacy. A woman travelling alone in a first-class compartment with male strangers occupied an uncomfortable position in the Victorian social order, particularly if she wished to sleep, which required closing her eyes and being visually undefended in a way that nice women of the era were not supposed to be in the presence of men who were not their husbands or family members. The ladies-only carriage offered a solution, an entire carriage, or a compartment within it, reserved for women travelling without male companions. Some railway companies provided them willingly, seeing them as a service. Others resisted, finding the administrative complexity burdensome. The Railway Regulation Act of 1868 eventually required companies running trains of a certain length to include at least one ladies' compartment per train. But tonight we are in our own compartment, just us, and the question of propriety does not arise. Tonight the question is only of the window, and the darkness gathering outside it, and the warmth of the compartment around us, and the sound of the wheels doing their patient work on the track. Let me tell you what the Victorian night looks like from a train window. By the time darkness is full, and it comes fully in October by 6 o'clock, sometimes earlier, the window changes its nature entirely. During the day it was a portal, something you looked through at the world going by. At night it becomes first a mirror, reflecting the interior of the compartment back at you, the gaslight and the velvet and your own face. But then your eyes adjust. and you start to see through the reflection rather than only the reflection, and the darkness outside becomes dimensional. You can see, if you look carefully, the shapes of things, the blackness of a hedgerow against the slightly less black sky, the pale ribbon of a road crossing beneath the railway, the orange dot of a lamp in a farmhouse window passing in seconds gone. And when you pass through a village, a proper Victorian village, not quite asleep yet at this hour but settling toward it, there's a moment where the train takes you through the edge of something lit. Not the full illumination of the village centre, but the spillage of lamplight from windows, the yellow-orange of gas lamps on the street, the warm oblong of a pub door open for a moment and then closed, and all of it goes past at a speed that makes it feel like something glimpsed rather than seen. A world having its evening without you, a world in which you are not a participant but a passing witness. I find these glimpses, these village-edge moments on a night train, among the most evocative experiences of travel. There is something about seeing a lit window from a moving train in the dark that presses directly on something deep. You know there are people in that room, warm, doing whatever people do at the end of an ordinary day, eating, talking, reading, sitting together in the particular way that families sit together when the day is winding down and there's nothing pressing requiring any of them to be anywhere in particular. You know this, and you are not part of it, and you are moving away from it, and it is gone, and none of that is sad exactly, but it's not nothing either. It's a kind of reminder that there are many lives, that warmth exists in countless forms in countless rooms, that the world is full of evenings being had simultaneously by people who will never meet you. The train carries you past all of them. Let me tell you about the engineering of what's carrying you, because I think understanding the machine is part of understanding the experience of being inside it. The Victorian locomotive in its mature form, the kind pulling the express trains of the 1880s, is a thing of considerable power and considerable beauty, though the beauty is functional rather than ornamental. It is a steam engine at the end of 5 decades of development, which means it has moved a very long way from the crude and unreliable machines that pulled the first passenger trains of the 1830s. By 1882, the technology is still developing rapidly. There are engineers at this moment whose careers will end with the great express locomotives of the turn of the century, enormous machines capable of pulling heavy trains at sustained speeds of 80 or 90 miles an hour. But what is currently at the front of your train is already a capable, relatively reliable, impressive machine. At the heart of it is fire, coal fire, burning in the firebox, heating water in the boiler to produce steam at high pressure. The pressure is the thing. Steam engines are fundamentally about the conversion of heat into pressure and pressure into motion. The steam drives pistons, the pistons drive wheels, and the wheels engage with the track, and the whole enormous assembly moves. The physics are elegant even if the machinery is heavy and hot and complicated. The men who run this machine are the driver and the fireman. The driver stands at the controls, throttle and regulator and brake, watching the line ahead, reading the signals, making the hundreds of small adjustments that keeping a fast train on a complex track requires. The fireman is responsible for the fire. He feeds it, manages it, regulates it. His work is physical. Coal is heavy and the firebox wants feeding continuously and requires a particular skill, the skill of maintaining a fire that is hot enough to generate the steam pressure the driver needs without burning so hot that it wastes coal or damages the boiler. A good fireman and a good driver work together in a wordless professional partnership that has something almost artistic about it, though neither of them would probably use that word. They are at the front of your train. You are at the back. Between you and them there are however many carriages make up tonight's consist. the word railway people use for the formation of a train, the specific carriages and their order, and the smoke from the locomotive is travelling backward along the length of the train, which means that the quality of the air in your compartment depends a great deal on where the wind is relative to the locomotive, and whether you've managed to get your window positioned in a way that discourages the admission of coal smoke, while still allowing enough air circulation to keep the carriage from getting too warm. This is actually an art. The Victorian railway window was operated by a leather strap with holes in it that looped over a brass stud to hold the window open at different positions. Too far open and you risked smoke, cinders, the particular gritty assault of a coal-fired machine's output at speed. Not open enough and the carriage got stuffy with the accumulated exhalation of several passengers over several hours. The correct position depended on the direction the locomotive was blowing, which depended on the wind, which depended on the direction of travel, which was always changing as the line curved through the landscape. Experienced Victorian travellers had opinions about windows, strong and specific opinions, and were not shy about acting on them. There's a small door in the window partition actually, a ventilator, a little hinged panel, that opened independently of the main window to allow air exchange without the full thermal drama of an open window. The Victorians were thoughtful about ventilation in enclosed spaces, driven partly by the prevailing medical theory of the era, which still carried echoes of the miasma thinking we talked about in another story on this channel. The idea that bad air in enclosed spaces was the cause, or at least the carrier of illness, meant that railway ventilation was taken seriously enough to be a subject of engineering attention, legal regulation, and occasional public controversy. Your window is positioned correctly, just barely ajar at the top, enough to feel the movement of slightly cool night air against the warmth of the carriage, not enough to let the smoke in. The balance is perfect. The air in the compartment is warm but not stuffy. It carries the faint smell of coal and the faint smell of velvet and something that might be the last traces of someone else's lunch, eaten here earlier in the day, bread and cold chicken perhaps, or something with mustard. You've been travelling for nearly 3 hours now, or perhaps longer. Time on a train in the evening when the window is dark and the carriage is warm and you have nowhere to be until you arrive has a different quality from time in most other situations. It moves, but you can't quite track it. The rhythm of the wheels does something to your sense of duration. 20 minutes passes and feels like 5. 5 minutes passes and feels like a considered inhabitable space. Your eyes are growing heavy, not dramatically, not suddenly. There's nothing alarming or unexpected about this. You knew it was coming. You've been half expecting it for an hour. The warmth and the motion and the sound and the particular quality of the darkness outside the window have all been conspiring toward this for the entire journey. And now the conspiracy is completing itself. Your eyelids are doing what they do when the body decides it's had enough of being awake and begins to lobby persuasively for the alternative. You don't fight it. Why would you fight it? You're on a train that knows where it's going. Someone else is driving. The dark countryside is rolling past outside and none of it requires anything from you. The velvet seat holds you. The strap held your coat holds your coat. The luggage rack holds your bag. Everything is held. Let your eyes close if they want to. Let them close. Now let me tell you something interesting, because I think the most interesting things to know about a subject are often the ones you discover when you're not quite looking for them. The things that come in sideways. The story of Victorian railways is largely told as a story about engineering and economics and class and empire. All of those things are true and important, and I'll come to some of them. But there's a less told strand of the railway story that I find just as compelling. which is the story of what the train did to time, not time as measured by clocks, time as experienced by the body and the mind of the person travelling. Before railways, England had many times, not one time but many. Each town had its own local time, based on the position of the sun. Bristol time was 10 minutes behind London time. Exeter time was 14 minutes behind. Edinburgh time was 17 minutes behind. When you travelled by coach at 8 or 10 miles an hour, the difference between local times was practically irrelevant. By the time you got from London to Bristol, you'd been on the road long enough that the 10-minute discrepancy between your watch and the local clock was the least of your concerns. The train changed this in a way that is hard to overstate. When you could travel from London to Bristol in 2 hours instead of 8, the 10-minute time difference suddenly became a practical problem. A train that left Paddington at noon London time would arrive in Bristol at 2 London time, but Bristol time said it was 10 minutes to 2. The timetables, which were the nervous system of the entire railway enterprise, the thing that made planned connections and scheduled arrivals possible, could not function if every station ran on its own local time. And so, beginning in the 1840s, the Great Western Railway, Brunel's Railway, the one that connected London to Bristol and beyond, began running its trains on London time throughout its entire network. This was called railway time, and railway time was, in effect, the first standardized time in England, the first agreement that an arbitrary clock time applied everywhere, regardless of what the sun said. By 1847, most railway companies had adopted this. By 1880, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, was being kept by the majority of public clocks in England. By 1880, the train had remade English time. I find this genuinely remarkable, not the technical fact of it. Standardized time is common sense once you have fast travel, but what it reveals about the nature of technology and the nature of change. The railways didn't just move people faster, they reorganized the fundamental framework of daily life. They made certain things that had seemed immutable, local time, the connection between the sun's position and the clock on the wall, suddenly contingent, negotiable, subject to the requirements of the network. Outside your window, if you looked, you would see a countryside that was living by time that the railways had given it. The clocks in the village churches synchronized, gradually and not without argument, to a time that originated in Greenwich. The station clock, important, authoritative, the clock that mattered more than any other clock in a town now connected to the network, kept railway time, and railway time was London time, and London time was the time that the whole country was being drawn toward. This is one of many things the Victorian railway accomplished without quite meaning to. The people who built the railways were building them for the obvious reasons: to move goods, to move people, to make money. The social and philosophical consequences were, for the most part, unplanned. They emerged from the fact of the railway's existence and the way that existence reshuffled the possible. Let me tell you about another one. Before railways, the English countryside was not static. It never was, that's a myth. But it was connected to the cities in a particular way, which was to say, not very much. Villages that were more than a day's coach journey from a city were effectively separate worlds. Their economies were local. Their culture was local. Their news arrived late, if at all. The people who lived in them mostly knew the people they lived near, married people from nearby parishes, worked land they'd worked, or their fathers had worked, or their grandfathers had worked. The world was legible at a walking pace. The railway reduced that. Not all at once, not without resistance, not without complicated feelings on all sides. But it reduced it. A village served by a branch line was suddenly within practical reach of the nearest city. People who had never had reason or means to travel more than 20 miles from where they were born could now theoretically be in London for the day. This was not uniformly experienced as a gift. It brought the city's goods, which was welcome. It brought the city's prices, which was complicated. It brought visitors who were not always sensitive to local customs. It brought economic forces that disrupted local trades. And it brought a certain homogenization of culture that was the first early symptom of what would become, over the following century and a half, a much more thorough leveling of regional distinctiveness. But it also brought things that people genuinely wanted. Medical care that had previously required a day's journey, newspapers that arrived fresh rather than days old, agricultural machinery, fabrics, foods, goods of every kind that could now travel from manufacturing centres to rural markets at a fraction of the previous cost. The Victorian railway was the infrastructure of Victorian commerce, and Victorian commerce was genuinely transformative for the material conditions of ordinary life in ways that are easy to overlook when you're focused on all the ways it was also exploitative. And it was also that your train is slowing, not stopping, not yet, but moderating. You can hear it in the wheel sound. Feel it in the slight change of pressure the deceleration creates. There's a signal somewhere, probably, or a stretch of track that requires caution, a junction where the line intersects with another, or a bridge, or a stretch of permanent way that's softer than the engineers would like. Victorian railways were still works in progress in many stretches. The building of the network had happened with extraordinary speed. 3,000 miles of track by 1845, 9,000 miles by 1860, 12,000 miles by 1870, and the speed of construction meant that some sections were better made than others, some embankments more stable, some cuttings more subject to the weather. The engineers kept fixing things as the things broke. It was a continuous process. The slowing gives you a moment in which the world outside the window is slightly more visible, slightly less blurred. There's a level crossing. You can see the gates, the lamp on the gatepost lit against the dark, the silhouette of a man waiting to open the gates after you've passed. On the road beyond the crossing, a wagon is stopped, horse standing quiet, driver sitting patient, waiting for the train to clear. He does this every day, probably. He knows this train. He has a practiced relationship with it, has calculated it into his evening, knows that if he times his departure from wherever he's been by this particular junction, the train will be gone by the time he gets there. This particular evening he's miscalculated by about 4 minutes. He's not bothered. You can tell that from the way he sits. The crossing passes, the gates open behind you, the wagon moves. The driver's evening resumes. He won't think about the train again today. You might think about this if you're in the mood for thinking. The way a long-distance journey takes you through dozens of other people's ordinary days. The gatekeeper and his gates. The farmer with the wagon. The woman with the complicated face on the platform hours ago, the cat on the fence, each of them having a specific and ongoing life that exists completely independently of yours, that was there before you arrived and will continue after you're gone. The train moves through the middle of all these lives for a moment, observed and observing, and then it's gone. And all of them go back to whatever they were doing. There's something both very large and very small about this feeling. Let me tell you about what the first-class dining car was like, because tonight's train might have one, and the possibility of food is worth considering. Victorian long-distance trains developed dining facilities gradually, and by the 1880s the better express services had acquired proper dining cars, carriages converted or purpose-built to serve meals while the train was in motion. This was not a simple logistical accomplishment. Cooking on a moving train required adaptations to equipment and technique. The kitchen at the back of the dining car had its stove fixed and braced against the motion. The cook developed a skill for managing things that wanted to slide at 60 miles an hour, for pouring liquid into a container that was not quite level and never quite still. The waitstaff developed a similar skill for moving through a rocking carriage with full plates. The food itself was not negligible. The great railway companies of the Victorian era, particularly those running the Prestige Expresses, the Flying Scotsman, the Cornish Riviera Express, the various titled services that became the showpieces of their respective companies, took the dining car seriously as a matter of competitive pride. The menus were multi-course and substantial: soup, fish, a main course of meat, roasted or braised, vegetables in season, dessert, cheese. The wine list was appropriate. The table linen was white and properly pressed. Eating a proper dinner on a moving train had a quality that I think is hard to fully convey to someone who hasn't experienced it. The food is the food. Good food on a good train, as I've described, but the experience of eating it is not the same as the experience of eating it in a restaurant or at home. The table is vibrating slightly. When you lift your glass, the wine moves in it with the motion of the train. When you look up from your plate, the window shows you moving darkness, the occasional light, the shape of a hill or a valley visible against the night sky. You are eating dinner inside a machine that is doing something remarkable, and the remarkableness is inescapable. People commented on this. There's something in the Victorian travel literature about the specific pleasure of a good meal taken in motion, a pleasure that combines the satisfaction of eating with the particular exhilaration of speed. Some people found the combination unsettling, particularly in the early decades when dining cars were newer and motion on trains less smoothly managed. Others found it exactly right, found that the slight unsteadiness was part of it, that it was part of what made it an experience rather than just a meal. If you've eaten on our train tonight, if you went to the dining car in the earlier, brighter hours of the journey and had your soup and your fish and your rather good piece of beef and a glass of something dark and appropriate, you're back in your compartment now, and the meal is settled, and the warmth of it is part of the weight in your limbs, part of the heaviness that has been building toward this for hours. The train's rhythm is constant now. The wheel sound on the rail, the gentle sway, the occasional deeper knock when the wheels pass over a junction. The gas light in the compartment has settled to its lowest point for the evening, because there's a kind of unspoken understanding that late in a long journey, when darkness is full outside, the light inside should dim its ambitions, not go out entirely. You'd need to light it again if someone got on, or if you wanted to read, but pull back to a glow that's easier on eyes that are already inclining towards sleep. The compartment smells of warmth and velvet and faintly of the coal that powers everything. It smells of the evening. It smells of a long journey nearly over. Let me tell you about the history of the railway compartment itself, because it's a history I find fascinating and a little strange. The design of the Victorian railway carriage developed not, as you might expect, from the practical requirements of transporting people at high speed, but from a much older design. The first-class carriage of the earliest railways was essentially 3 stagecoach bodies bolted onto a flatbed railway wagon. 3 coach bodies, side by side, each with its own door, its own seats, its own small windows. The passengers travelled in these adapted coaches as they'd previously travelled in actual coaches, facing backward or forward, looking out at the world, enclosed in a small private world that had been lifted off the road and placed on rails. This is where the compartment comes from. It's an inheritance from coach travel. The idea that a small group of passengers would share an enclosed space with no access to the rest of the train, no corridor, no way to move from one compartment to another, was carried directly from the coaching age into the railway age. The train was in some ways a collection of private coaches stacked end to end on a single set of wheels. The consequences of this design were various. One consequence was the intimacy of the compartment we've already discussed. Another, less pleasant consequence was that passengers were locked in their compartments for the duration of the journey, with no access to a toilet. I mention this because it's one of the genuine practical difficulties of Victorian railway travel, and it's not usually discussed in the romantic accounts. The Victorian railway journey, particularly a long one, required planning of a kind that modern travellers with their sealed, climate-controlled carriages and their 2 toilets per carriage have largely been freed from. You planned around stops. You identified the stations where the train paused long enough for passengers to disembark briefly and attend to necessities, and you timed your journey accordingly. The train operators facilitated this by building station refreshment rooms with facilities, and by scheduling stops at appropriate intervals on the longest services. Railway companies were not entirely oblivious to the physical realities of their passengers. The corridor carriage, a carriage where the compartments open onto a continuous interior passageway running the length of the carriage, allowing movement between compartments without having to get off the train, was developed in the 1880s and 1890s, and its introduction is one of the genuine quality of life improvements in the history of rail travel. The Midland Railway is often credited with introducing the first true corridor trains on their best services in the 1890s, but in 1882, on many services including the one we're imagining tonight, the compartment is still sealed. There is a door to the platform and a door to the platform on the other side, and that's it. The walls of your compartment extend to the walls of the carriage. For the present journey you planned ahead. The last stop before your destination was 40 minutes ago, and you attended to what needed attending to, and now you are settled and the compartment is yours, and the next stop is where you're going. Let me tell you about the people who built the railways. Not the engineers and financiers who tend to get the credit in the history books, though Brunel and Stevenson and Hudson and all the rest are interesting in their own right, but the people who actually drove the metal into the ground, because that is also a Victorian railway story, and it's one that the comfortable first-class compartment doesn't tell on its own. The navvies. The word comes from navigator, specifically canal navigator, because the men who built the canals in the 18th century and then went on to build the railways in the 19th carried the name with them. The navvy was a construction labourer of a specific and formidable kind, mobile, skilled in the particular skills of earth-moving and heavy physical work, organised in gangs, nomadic in the sense that he moved with the work as the work moved across the country. Railway construction in the 1840s employed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 navvies at any given time. That number is staggering when you hold it against the total population of England, which was around 16 million in 1841. 1 in every 50 or 60 people was a navvy, and they were building something at a pace and scale that had no precedent. Miles of track per week, driven through whatever landscape was in the way, through hills, which meant cuttings excavated by hand with pick and barrow and explosives and a certain cheerful indifference to danger, through valleys, which meant embankments built up from material excavated from the cuttings, moved by wheelbarrow, up planks that were steeper than comfort suggests, through rivers, which meant bridges, through solid rock, which meant tunnels. The Woodhead Tunnel, 3 miles of tunnel through the Pennines, completed in 1845, killed 32 workers and injured another 200 in the course of its construction. The Box Tunnel, Brunel's 2-mile tunnel through Box Hill in Wiltshire, required 4,000 men working continuously for 4 years, consumed 100 tons of gunpowder and 30 million bricks, and killed an unknown but significant number of workers in the process. The records are incomplete. Deaths on Victorian construction projects were not always carefully documented. The navvies lived in camps along the line under construction, in temporary accommodations that were Spartan even by Victorian working-class standards. They ate a lot. The physical work demanded extraordinary caloric input, and navvy food culture was its own thing. Large quantities of bread and beef and beer, consumed with the practical enthusiasm of men who needed fuel. They drank a lot, which generated social conflict with the settled communities near the camps. They moved on when the work moved on, leaving behind a track and whatever other marks they'd made on the landscape, and setting up camp in the next place. They were in many ways a separate world within Victorian England, mobile where most of England was settled, physical where most respectable England aspired to be sedentary, dangerous in their work and in their leisure, in ways that made them a source of anxiety to the communities they passed through, even as those communities were often economically dependent on the money the navvies spent. They came from everywhere, England, Ireland, especially Ireland, during and after the famine years, Scotland, Wales, and from everywhere they brought the mixes of culture and language and custom that make the navvy camps, in the historical record, feel more internally diverse than most Victorian social groups. The railways they built are still there. A great deal of the track laid in the 1840s and 1850s is still in use. The cuttings they dug with picks and wheelbarrows are still exactly where they put them. The embankments they raised are still supporting track. The tunnels they blasted through rock with black powder and muscle are still being travelled through by people with no idea that they're passing through the work of those hands, including this tunnel. We're in another one. I noticed the sound change a moment ago and didn't say anything. Let it arrive on you if it hasn't already. The window is black again, the reflected compartment floating in nothing. The sound is full and close. The wheels are more audible than usual. Think about the men who blasted this particular piece of rock out of this particular hillside sometime in the 1850s or 1860s so that a track could run through it and a train like this one could carry passengers like you through the dark of an October evening. Those men are completely unknown. Nobody recorded their names. Nobody knows which specific navvy drove the last blast or laid the last brick of the tunnel lining. They did their work and moved on, and the tunnel remained, and has been receiving trains and their passengers for 30 years now, and will continue to do so for long decades to come. There is something worth thinking about there, if you're inclined to think about things at this hour. The tunnel ends, the sound opens out, the October night resumes. Let me tell you about the railway hotels. The great Victorian railway hotels were, in their time, something genuinely extraordinary. Not just hotels with a railway station nearby, hotels that were physically integrated into the terminus buildings, accessible directly from the platform, that existed specifically to serve the railway traveller, and were conceived as part of the railway experience itself. Staying at a railway hotel was, for a certain class of Victorian traveller, part of what you did when you travelled by train. You arrived, you walked through the terminus and through a door, and you were in the hotel. You ate dinner. You slept. In the morning you walked back through the door and onto the platform and continued your journey. The Midland Grand Hotel at St Pancras, which opened in 1873 and is now the St Pancras Renaissance Hotel, is the most famous example. Its architect, George Gilbert Scott, designed a building of Gothic extravagance, pointed arches, soaring towers, a staircase of such theatrical grandeur that it was used as a backdrop for theatrical productions even before it was adapted for film, that was intended to make an impression on arriving and departing passengers of the Midland Railway. The impression it made was one of unambiguous ambition. The Midland Railway wanted its terminus and hotel to say, beyond any possible doubt, "We are here, we are important, and we intend to be taken seriously." Inside the hotel, the amenities were considerable. Private bedrooms with proper beds, a dining room serving proper meals, reading rooms, smoking rooms, and all of this in the immediate orbit of a railway terminus connected to the great network of the country. For a Victorian business traveller, and the Victorian railways created business travel as a regular feature of professional life in a way it hadn't quite been before, the railway hotel was enormously practical. You could arrive by evening train, dine, sleep in a decent bed, and be on the first available morning service to your next destination without any of the subsidiary logistics that ordinary travel involved. The hotels were also, like everything associated with the Victorian railways, deeply class stratified. The Midland Grand was a first-class establishment in the literal sense, designed for first-class passengers of a certain income and social position. There were other, lesser establishments catering to other classes of traveller, just as the railways themselves had first, second and third-class carriages. The social geography of railway travel was reproduced in the social geography of the structures that served it. Tonight, if your journey ends in a city, you might be staying in one of these places, a room booked in advance, a bed that will receive you in an hour or two with the warmth and the clean sheets that you'd expect from an establishment that takes itself seriously. The kind of bed that feels after a long train journey like something actively good. Not just comfortable, but kind. The kind of bed you fall into already more asleep than awake. But we're not there yet. The journey is still continuing. Let me tell you a little more about the specific experience of this particular time in history, because I want to be specific about 1882 and what is happening in England in 1882, because it matters to where we are in the story. England in 1882 is at the height of something. The height of what exactly depends on who you ask. The height of the Victorian era, certainly. Victoria has been on the throne for 45 years and has a good 2 decades left. The height of the British Empire, if you measure by territorial extent, though that won't peak for another decade. The height of the Industrial Revolution's first great wave, or the beginning of its second. The height of a particular kind of social certainty, a particular way of understanding the world that is already, in 1882, beginning to be questioned by forces it hasn't quite recognized yet. The train you're on, the service you're taking, is a product of this height. It runs on schedule. It is maintained by a company that takes seriously its obligation to run it on schedule. The company's obligation is enforced by Acts of Parliament, specifically the railway regulation legislation that accumulated through the Victorian era as the government worked out what it owed its citizens in terms of safe, reliable public transportation. The train carries passengers of all classes, though each class travels differently. It is part of a network that by 1882 connects every significant town in England and most of the significant towns in Scotland and Wales. This network is the nervous system of Victorian England. Not a metaphor, quite literally the infrastructure through which information, goods and people move. The telegraph, whose wires run alongside the railway on poles you can see from the window during daylight hours, carries the empire's communications at the speed of electricity. The train carries everything else. A letter posted in London can reach Glasgow in a day. Coal from the Welsh valleys reaches factories in Birmingham in hours. Fish from the Cornish coast reaches the London markets fresh, which was not possible before the railway. A woman in Norwich can visit her sister in Liverpool and return in the same day, which would have been a 3-day journey 20 years earlier. The world has been made smaller. This is the phrase people used, and it was accurate. The effective distances between places had shrunk, not because the places had moved, but because the time to traverse the space between them had diminished. England in 1882 is a country that knows itself more thoroughly than it has at any previous point in history, because the railways have made knowing possible. A railway map of England is a map of a nervous system, and the nervous system is alive and working. You are one of several hundred people travelling on this particular line tonight. Beside you in the dark, not literally beside you, you have your compartment to yourself, but beside you in the sense of travelling the same iron road through the same October night, are other passengers with other destinations and other purposes. A commercial traveller going to a meeting in a city he visits 6 times a year, who knows this train's timetable better than he knows some members of his own family. A young woman going home from London after a visit to cousins, with a hat box in the luggage rack and a novel in her lap, and the slightly glazed look of someone who has been in stimulating company for a week and is quietly delighted to be going home. A retired military man going to a country house party, a social obligation of the kind that consumed a great deal of the energy of the Victorian upper classes. A family in a third-class compartment near the front of the train, parents and 3 children, the children finally asleep in the way children sleep on trains, boneless, total, the kind of sleep that makes adults slightly envious, while the parents sit in the particular quiet of people who have been managing young children all day and are grateful for the silence, unable quite to sleep themselves. None of them know you're thinking about them. None of them know there is any story being told tonight. They're just going somewhere, as people do, on a train that is taking them there. You've been thinking about the railway's history. Let me think about it with you a little more, because I'm not finished with it. The beginning. The absolute beginning. On the 27th of September, 1825, a locomotive named Locomotion Number 1, designed by George Stephenson, pulled a train from Darlington to Stockton in the north of England, 27 miles. The journey took, with stops, about 2 hours. Maximum speed, approximately 12 miles an hour. This was not the first time a steam locomotive had pulled anything. Steam locomotives had been operating in industrial contexts, at mines, at quarries, on short-haul industrial lines, for 20 years before this. The technology was not new. What was new was the scale of the ambition. A passenger service, a public railway, a timetabled journey between 2 towns. The Stockton and Darlington Railway is generally cited as the first public passenger railway in the world to use steam locomotion, and while historians will argue about the precise definition and whether various earlier operations qualify under various framings, the Stockton and Darlington is the one that matters because it was the beginning of something. It was the demonstration that this was possible, not just possible for moving coal from a mine to a harbour, but possible for moving people, for creating a service, for doing with steam and iron what coaches had done with horses but faster. 5 years later, in 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened. This is the one that matters for the story of passenger rail travel as we know it. It was the first railway to run exclusively on steam traction, the first to run to a published timetable, the first to carry passengers as its primary business rather than as a sideline to freight. It ran between 2 cities that were already in 1830 enormously important to the British economy: Liverpool, the great port; Manchester, the great manufacturing centre; and it was an immediate and overwhelming success. The opening day was attended by the most famous public figures of the era. William Huskisson, the Member of Parliament for Liverpool and a supporter of the railway, was killed at the opening ceremony when he stepped in front of a locomotive and was run over. He is often called the first railway fatality, though that's not quite accurate. Workers had died during construction, and there had been other earlier deaths involving railways in various configurations. But Huskisson's death was public and witnessed by thousands and reported across the country, and it established from the very first day of what would become the passenger railway era that the railway was powerful in ways that were not purely beneficial, that the machine at the centre of all this wonder was also dangerous, that this new world required new kinds of attention. This is worth sitting with, I think. The railway era began with a death on its opening day. The enthusiasm for what the railway could do and what it could become was not dampened by this. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway went on to transform both cities in the region and eventually the whole country. But the death was noted. It was there at the beginning as a reminder that the power being harnessed was not gentle. In the 52 years between that opening day and the October evening in 1882 when we're travelling, the railways have remade England. Not metaphorically, actually remade it. The landscape is physically different because of the railways. The cuttings and embankments and viaducts and tunnels are additions to the land, structures built on a scale that previously only cathedrals and fortifications approached. The great viaducts, brick arches striding across valleys, 60 or 70 or 100 feet high, carrying the line over rivers and wetlands and settled valleys, are among the most visually significant structures in the English landscape, and many of them are, considered purely as engineering, beautiful, not designed to be beautiful, designed to be strong and functional, but achieving something that functions as beauty because of the scale and the consistency and the way they sit in the landscape as if they were always going to be there. The social landscape is different too in ways we've touched on. The cities are different. London is larger and more complex because the railways made London larger and more complex, pulling in workers and goods and information at rates that no previous technology had enabled. The suburbs exist because of the railways. The idea of living outside the city and commuting in, which is now such a basic fact of urban life that people barely register it as a choice, was created by the railway. Before you could move between home and work at speed, home and work had to be in the same place. The railway separated them, made the separation practical, created the commuter, who is one of the great Victorian inventions, an entirely new kind of person who didn't exist before the railway made him possible. I think about this sometimes, how the railway created new categories of person. The commuter, the tourist, because the excursion train, the cheap weekend journey to the seaside, made tourism available to classes of person who had never previously had either the time or the means to leave their city. The railway brought the seaside to the working classes of industrial England in a way that is genuinely hard to overstate. Before the railway, a trip to Brighton or Whitby or Scarborough or the Cornish coast was a weeks-long undertaking available only to those with money and leisure. After the railway, it was a day trip, a family day out, a Saturday's adventure, return ticket purchased for a few shillings at the station, train packed with factory workers and shop assistants and their families, children who had never seen the sea about to see the sea for the first time. What that must have looked like, what it must have felt like. The particular astonishment of arriving at the coast, stepping off the train into the salt air, seeing the water for the first time in a life that had been spent entirely inland. There is a category of experience that I think we've impoverished by making it too easy and too commonplace to be astonishing anymore. The sea is not astonishing when you've been to the sea 15 times. It was astonishing to the Victorian factory child who took a railway excursion to Whitby in 1875 and saw it for the first time. The train is doing something now, a change in the sound, a change in the rhythm. We're approaching something, I think, a slowing, a different quality of darkness outside, the lights of a town coming into view on the horizon, the edge of something settled and lit after miles of unlit countryside. Not your destination, not yet. A stop, though, a station where some passengers will get off and some will get on, and the doors will open briefly and the cold night air will come in, and you'll hear the sounds of the platform, the voices, the porter's call, the brief ceremony of arrival and departure. Let me tell you what a Victorian station at night looks like. The gas lights on the platform make their own kind of weather. They're not bright by modern standards. A gas lamp produces maybe as much light as a modern 40-watt bulb, perhaps a little more, the particular warm, slightly yellow light of burning gas that is much softer than electric light and leaves more of the world in shadow. The platform is a series of these pools of light with dark stretches between them. The station building, the waiting room, the refreshment room, the offices, they're lit too, and the light from their windows spills out across the platform in oblong patches, orange warm. The sound changes when the train stops at a station. The wheel sound goes. The hiss and breath of the locomotive is more audible now, and underneath it the station sounds, a trolley moving, a voice giving an instruction, the sound of a door. The cold air has its own quality of sound, slightly sharper than warm air. People get off. You watch them through your slightly imperfect window. These passengers who are ending their journey here, gathering their coats and their bags, stepping down onto the platform with the slightly stiff movements of people who have been sitting for a long time. Some of them have been met. Figures on the platform, a husband, a parent, someone holding a lamp and scanning the carriage windows for a face. The reunions happen on the platform in the gas lamp light, brief and warm. People get on, stamping their feet a little from the cold of the platform, settling into their compartments, adjusting their coats. In your compartment nobody gets on. The corridor stays empty, the door stays closed. A whistle. The engine builds itself back up from the station stop. The platform begins to move past the window. The reunion scenes slide away. The gas lamps go one by one. The town recedes, and then the countryside again, the October night again, the wheel sound on the rail again. You have perhaps 40 minutes left in this journey. 40 minutes is a particular kind of time, long enough that you can't quite see the end of it yet, short enough that you know you're almost there. The knowledge of arrival changes the quality of the remaining time. Not anxious. There's nothing to be anxious about. You have your ticket, you know your destination, you know someone is meeting you or your hotel is booked or your own house is waiting, but aware that this particular space, this compartment with its velvet and its gas lamp and its slightly imperfect window, is temporary, that in 40 minutes it will let you go, and you will go out into the cold of another platform, and this small warm world will close its doors and continue without you. The best journeys have this quality, not the journey that lasts so long it becomes its own kind of tedium, but the journey that has been long enough to complete itself and is now approaching its end with the right amount of time still left. You're at that point now. The journey has done its work on you. It has carried you through 100 miles of England and several hours of October and a tunnel and a level crossing and a dinner and a station stop and all the particular accumulation of sensation that rail travel provides. And now it is bringing you toward rest. Let me tell you something about the way the Victorians thought about arrival. There's a word that the Victorian guidebooks use that I find beautiful. destination. It's ordinary enough now, worn smooth by use, but in the Victorian era it carried weight. Your destination was where you were going, not just geographically but in some larger sense. The journey was the journey, and the destination was what justified it, what gave it meaning, what it was for. The great railway termini, Paddington, Victoria, King's Cross, St Pancras, Waterloo, were designed to embody this. They are arrival buildings, built to receive people who are completing journeys, built to mark the end of something and the beginning of something else. The great iron and glass roofs over the train sheds are theatrical in exactly this sense. You enter from the street, from the ordinary world, and you pass under this enormous engineered sky, and you are in a different world, the world of departure and arrival, of journeys in progress and journeys ended. There is ceremony in it. There is an architecture of feeling. The smaller stations, the county stations, the market town stations, the junction stations like the one we departed from hours ago, have their own version of this. Less grand but no less considered. The Victorian station was not a purely functional building. It was a civic building, a statement about the community it served, an investment in the idea that this place mattered enough to have a proper station, properly maintained, with proper facilities, looking like something rather than just anything. The station gardens that many smaller Victorian stations maintained, flower beds on the platform, hanging basket, sometimes quite elaborate arrangements of seasonal planting, were part of this. They said, "We are here, we take care of things, we are a place worth arriving at. You are arriving somewhere worth arriving at." Let me describe the approach to the station, because the approach is its own experience. The train has been slowing for a while now, not the cautious slowing of a junction or a signal, but a more deliberate deceleration, the train consciously preparing itself for the stop. The sound of the wheels changes again, slower in its repetition, the rhythm losing its steady momentum and becoming something more considered. The carriage's sway settles. Outside the window you're in the edge of something. A town, your town, the place you're arriving at. The lights of it are around you now, not ahead of you on the horizon, but on both sides, above you, the rooftops and the streets and the lit windows of a place going about its evening. You pass through a gap in the town. The railway cuts through the urban fabric in the way it always does, taking the straight line that the town streets couldn't follow, running through gardens and behind houses and over a road on a bridge. And then the platform appears. The station platform comes into view on your left, the gas lamps in their pools of light. The platform flowers, the porter already in motion, the station building with its lit windows and its clock, the clock showing the correct time, railway time, Greenwich Mean Time, the standardized time the railway gave the nation, and the train pulling up beside the platform with the magnificent mechanical intention of a thing arriving where it intended to arrive. The sound dies. The motion dies. The wheels stop. This is the end of the journey. Or it is, and it isn't. Because what is ending is the motion, the sound, the particular experience of travelling. What is beginning is the arrival, which has its own pleasures and its own qualities and deserves a moment. You gather your coat. You reach up for your bag from the luggage rack. You stand, slightly stiff in the way that sitting for several hours produces, and you feel the floor of the carriage under your feet not moving, which is a different thing from the floor moving. Your body remembers it was stationary once and adjusts back, though the adjustment takes a moment, and for a few seconds you feel, almost imperceptibly, a phantom rocking, the body expecting the motion that has stopped. The compartment door, the corridor, the step down to the platform, The cold air, which is genuinely cold now, October cold at night, the particular dry cold of an English autumn evening after a day that was warm enough to be unremarkable. Your breath makes a small cloud. Your shoes on the stone platform make the sounds that shoes on stone platforms make. The station. The end. Except, and this is the thing I want to sit with, the end of the journey is not where the journey ends. Not in any important sense. You carry the journey with you. The 3 hours on the train, the dark countryside going past, the tunnel and the level crossing and the glimpsed windows of people having their evenings, the warmth and the velvet and the wheel sound, the quality of time that the journey had, you carry all of it out of the station and into whatever comes next. Let me step back for a moment because I want to tell you something about the period we've been living in tonight, the 1880s, that I haven't told you yet, and that I think illuminates something interesting about the particular train journey we've been on. The 1880s in England are a decade of competition, railway competition specifically, which was intense and sometimes spectacular. The Victorian railway industry had developed from its entrepreneurial beginnings into a mature oligopoly, a relatively small number of large companies dividing up the traffic of the country among themselves, sometimes in cooperation and sometimes in fierce conflict. The conflicts produced some of the most entertaining and high-stakes dramas in Victorian commercial history. The most famous was the Race to the North. This happened in 1888 and then again in 1895, but the competitive dynamic that produced it was building throughout the 1880s. 2 railway routes connected London to Edinburgh, the East Coast route, a partnership between the Great Northern, North Eastern and North British Railways, and the West Coast route, a partnership between the London and North Western and Caledonian Railways. Both routes were long, both routes were profitable, and both routes were used by the Anglo-Scottish express services that were the prestige services of their day. The trains that carried the mail and the business travellers and the members of Parliament and the society passengers and everyone else who needed to move between the capitals. In the summer of 1888, the 2 routes began competing on journey time. The East Coast knocked 30 minutes off their scheduled time between London and Edinburgh. The West Coast responded. The East Coast responded again. Within a few weeks, both routes were running their overnight express services faster than they had ever run them before, in a public competition for the title of fastest service to Edinburgh that attracted enormous press coverage and public interest, and that both companies ultimately had to be talked out of by the Board of Trade, which had concerns about safety. The 1895 race was even more extreme. On the night of August 22nd, 1895, the East Coast Express from King's Cross to Aberdeen covered the 524 miles in 8 hours and 40 minutes, an average speed of just over 60 miles per hour including stops. The West Coast matched and then surpassed this. There were nights in August 1895 when the competing trains were running at speeds that their equipment was not quite designed for, driven by engine drivers who were being asked to push their locomotives beyond normal operating limits in pursuit of competitive glory. The races produced extraordinary journalism, crowds at intermediate stations watching the trains fly through, and the very real possibility of serious accident. They also produced some of the most celebrated performances in the history of British steam locomotion. Engine number 790 Hardwicke on the London and North Western Railway, for instance, ran the leg from Crewe to Carlisle in 126 minutes, an average speed of over 67 miles per hour over difficult terrain, a performance that was considered remarkable at the time and was remembered for decades. The races ended not by agreement to stop racing, but by the railways quietly agreeing not to race anymore, at least not publicly and not at those speeds. The Board of Trade's concerns were legitimate, The speeds that the 1895 races reached were genuinely at the edge of what the track and the locomotives of the day could handle safely. A derailment at those speeds would have been catastrophic, but I tell you about the races because they illustrate something about the 1880s and the railway world in which your journey tonight is happening. This is an industry that is competitive, ambitious, proud, and actively pushing the limits of what its technology can do. The train you're on is not racing, it's an ordinary evening service on an ordinary October night, but it is the product of an industry that is in a phase of genuinely exciting development, that is solving problems and finding capabilities and building an argument in iron and steam and timetable precision for its own centrality to the life of the nation, and the nation is watching. The Victorian public relationship with the railways was complex and deep. People travelled on trains, obviously, but they also wrote about them, painted them, photographed them, argued about them, worried about them, celebrated them. The railway was the dominant technology of the age in the way that the internet was the dominant technology of the early 21st century, and it generated the same mixture of enthusiasm and anxiety and debate that every dominant technology generates. The anxiety included genuine concerns about safety, which were not irrational. Victorian railway accidents happened, and some of them were serious. The Tay Bridge disaster of 1879, 3 years before tonight's journey, is still very present in public memory. The bridge carrying the North British Railway over the Tay estuary between Dundee and the north collapsed on the night of December 28, 1879, during a violent storm, taking with it the express passenger train that happened to be crossing at the time. 75 people died. The disaster was caused by a combination of design flaws, poor construction, and inadequate maintenance, and it generated exactly the kind of investigation and public debate that a catastrophe involving a new technology generates. What are the standards? Who is responsible? Can this be prevented? How do we know the bridges and viaducts and embankments that carry these trains are safe? The answers were not immediately satisfying. The inquiry into the Tay Bridge disaster produced recommendations that were acted on only gradually and unevenly. The regulation of railway construction and operation improved over time, but improvement was incremental rather than immediate, and the public awareness that things could go catastrophically wrong was sustained by the steady background level of smaller accidents that the Victorian railways, with their growing traffic and their varying quality of infrastructure, continued to produce. Tonight, sitting in your compartment on your particular train, this is not something you're consciously thinking about, but it's in the background somewhere, as risks tend to be when they're managed rather than eliminated. You know the railway is safe enough. You've travelled on it dozens or hundreds of times. The statistics, if you thought about them, would reassure you. But the background awareness is there, and it doesn't diminish the pleasure. If anything, the faint edge of managed risk is part of what makes the railway experience rich rather than merely mechanical. You are being carried at speed through the dark by a very large machine operated by people you'll never see. You've trusted yourself to this, and the trust has been rewarded, as it nearly always is. That's not nothing. Let me come back to your compartment. Let me come back to where we actually are. You've arrived. I said you'd arrived, and you did arrive, and now I'm taking you backward, which is something narrators are allowed to do. We're back on the train, because the train is where the story is most alive, and I have more to tell you about what it meant to be in this particular place, in this particular time. The compartment is your world tonight. Let me spend a little more time in it. The upholstery, the buttons, the slight give and resistance of the velvet under your weight, Victorian railway carriage upholstery was taken seriously because it was the primary interface between the passenger and the carriage, the place where the passenger's body actually made contact with the train's interior world. It was also practically a significant maintenance challenge. Fabric in an environment that is constantly being used, that is subject to the outdoor coats and muddy boots and spilled refreshments of hundreds of passengers per week, that is exposed to the coal smoke that finds its way into every carriage, does not last forever without attention. The railway companies had their own upholstery shops, workshops for the maintenance and renewal of carriage interiors, staffed by people who did nothing but this work. The windows. We've spent time with the view through them, but the windows themselves are worth noting. Victorian railway carriage windows evolved significantly over the first decades of the railway era. The earliest carriages had very small windows, almost like carriage windows, set high in the body panels. As the technology matured and the understanding of what passengers wanted became clearer, the windows grew. By the 1880s, first-class windows are substantial, providing a genuine panoramic view of the passing landscape. They're double-hung sash windows in some designs, sliding in others, operated by that leather strap with holes that I mentioned earlier, designed to be adjustable by the passenger without requiring mechanical expertise. The glass is good quality, not perfectly flat, not perfectly clear, but serviceable, well above the quality of the cheapest glazing available. First-class passengers deserved first-class windows. The lighting. The gas lamps in your compartment are enclosed in small glass globes that protect the flame from drafts and prevent sparks from escaping, a safety measure driven by the obvious fire risk of open flame in a carriage full of upholstery and woodwork. The globes are accessible for the lighting and adjustment of the wick by the carriage attendant, who at the beginning of evening services goes through each carriage with a taper lighting the lamps in sequence. The ceremony of lamp lighting in a Victorian railway carriage is a specific moment. You know the evening service has truly begun when the lamp is lit and the soft globe of light appears in the compartment. The walls. Panelled in dark wood, mahogany or a good substitute, stained to look like mahogany, which most first-class carriages aspired to. The panels are fitted with mirrors in some compartments, small ones between the windows, which serve the practical purpose of allowing passengers to check their appearance and the social purpose of adding brightness to what would otherwise be a relatively dark interior. The mirrors in a gaslit railway compartment at night reflect the lamp and the passengers' faces and the darkness beyond the window, all at once in a composition that is accidental and often rather beautiful. The temperature. Victorian railway carriages were heated variously and imperfectly. The foot warmer was the original solution, a tin container filled with hot water or acetate of soda, rented from the station at the beginning of a journey and placed under your feet. This worked reasonably well for keeping your feet warm, and moderately well for keeping the lower part of the compartment at a tolerable temperature, but did not address the general ambience of the upper part of the carriage or the effect of cold air coming through window joins. By the 1880s, some companies had developed pipe-based steam heating systems that circulated steam from the locomotive through the carriages, which worked better but required careful management and was not universally adopted. On tonight's train there may be a steam heating system, or there may be foot warmers, or there may be both, or there may be a certain philosophical acceptance of the cold that the better coat and the thicker upholstery partially address. You are warm enough. The compartment is warm enough. The particular warmth of a well-maintained Victorian railway carriage on an October night, which is not the aggressive warmth of central heating but the accumulated gentler warmth of insulation and body heat, and something that might technically be called steam heating, is exactly enough. It is the right temperature for a long journey towards sleep. Let me talk about the sound for a moment, because the sound is the thing that does the most work. The wheel sound on the rail is not one sound, it's many sounds braided together, and what you hear at any given moment depends on the speed of the train, the type of track, the state of the wheels, the weather outside, and the acoustic properties of whatever landscape you're passing through. In a cutting, the sound is enclosed, directed, present. On an embankment, it opens out, disperses slightly, gains a quality of space. In the open countryside on a still night, the sound travels and you're aware, faintly, of how much of it is going outward into the world beyond the carriage. The dominant rhythm is the rail joint. Where one length of rail meets the next, there's a gap, small but sufficient to create a sound when the wheel crosses it. In the Victorian era, the rail lengths were shorter than the continuously welded rail that became standard in the 20th century, which means the joints come more frequently and the sound has more pulse in it. Da-dum, da-dum. This is the iconic sound of a steam-era train, and it is genuinely not the sound of modern trains on modern track. It's a percussion instrument keeping time at roughly the speed of walking at rest and the speed of running at full pace, varying with the train's speed, forming the underlying beat over which everything else, the hiss of steam, the squeal of a wheel on a curve, the knock of the carriage suspension, plays its parts. This sound does something to you over time. Over 2 hours or 3 hours or 4, the sound becomes part of your body's experience of itself. Not noticed consciously, you've stopped consciously noticing it after the first hour, but present, shaping things. The rhythm coordinates with your breathing without your asking it to. The heartbeat finds something like a relationship with it. The body, which has a deep animal preference for rhythm and pattern and regularity, settles into it. This is, I think, a significant part of why trains make people sleepy. Not just the motion, though the motion matters, and not just the warmth and the enclosure, though those matter too. The sound, the persistent, repetitive, slightly varying but fundamentally patterned sound of wheels on rail, maintained for hours, working on the nervous system with the patient efficiency of a lullaby that never ends, a lullaby for adults. That's what a long train journey is, at its best. Everything conspiring to tell your body that it can let go. The motion saying someone else is steering. The warmth saying you don't need to generate this yourself, it's provided. The sound saying this is regular, this is consistent, this is the sound of a world that is doing what it's supposed to do and doesn't need your help. Let go. Let me tell you about the people who operated the Victorian railways. Not just the engineers and the managers, but the people who actually ran the trains day to day, because they're fascinating and their world is largely invisible to the passengers they served. The engine driver in 1882 is a skilled worker of a very specific kind. His path to the footplate, the term for the platform at the front of the locomotive where the driver and fireman stood, typically began in his youth, working in the locomotive sheds as a cleaner. A cleaner's job was to clean the engines, oil them, prepare them for the day's work, learn their specific quirks and habits. Each locomotive had its own personality, in the sense that no two were quite the same despite coming from the same design specifications. One might have a tendency to run hot, another might be finicky about steam pressure. The cleaner learned these things through physical proximity and attention. From cleaner, a man might advance to past cleaner, meaning he was qualified to take the footplate in emergencies, and then to fireman, and then, after many years of demonstrating competence and reliability and the particular emotional steadiness that operating a powerful machine at speed requires, to driver. The driver's status in Victorian working-class culture was high. He was skilled, trusted, paid significantly better than many comparable workers, and had a responsibility that was genuinely serious. A locomotive driver made decisions in real time, at speed, that could affect the lives of everyone on his train. The discipline required, the necessity of showing up on time, sober, in the right mental state, day after day, year after year, was considerable. Victorian railway companies took this discipline seriously enough to have elaborate systems of inspection, reporting, and discipline. Drivers were observed, assessed, subject to review if their performance was questioned. The company's interest in safety, not purely ethical but also heavily financial, since railway accidents were expensive in multiple dimensions, made the monitoring of the people who actually operated the trains a business necessity. The result was a workforce that was, by Victorian standards, relatively well regulated and relatively well paid, with the costs of regulation being the constant surveillance and the psychological weight of the responsibility. The fireman's job, as I mentioned earlier, was the physical work, coal and heat, but it was also the apprenticeship for the driver's role, and the good fireman was already developing the skills of observation and judgment that the driver's job would require, knowing when the steam pressure was right, knowing how the locomotive sounded when it was working well versus when something was off, knowing the road, the term for knowledge of the specific line, where the grades and the curves and the signals were, how much speed to carry into a particular section, where to begin braking for a station stop. Knowledge of the road was essential. Victorian locomotives did not have the computerized systems and automatic warnings of modern trains. The driver had his instruments and his experience and his knowledge of the route. He knew from having driven it hundreds of times that this particular curve required this particular speed and that this particular grade required this particular throttle setting. He knew where the signals were and what each signal position meant and what the correct response to each was. He carried all of this in his head and applied it continuously, in the dark and the rain and the cold and the heat, at speeds that still, in 1882, felt to many people quite remarkable. The station staff, the station master, who was the governor of his particular station, and took that governance seriously, aware that the station was a public face of the company, and that his station's reputation was, to a considerable extent, his personal reputation. He inspected the platform, the building, the gardens, the arrangements for the passengers. He managed the staff, the porters, the booking clerks, the refreshment room operators, with the particular blend of authority and personal attention that made Victorian station management a distinctive social world. The porters moved baggage. This is not a trivial observation. Victorian travellers, particularly first-class travellers, travelled with substantial amounts of luggage by any modern standard. The leather trunk, the hat box, the portmanteau, the multiple smaller bags that Victorian packing customs required. Moving this luggage from carriage to platform to cab to hotel and back again was a continuous and physically demanding operation, and the porters who did it were the visible, mobile face of the railway's service commitment. The booking clerk. The ticket window was a specific social encounter, bounded by the formal transaction of purchasing a ticket, but charged with the slight awkwardness that commercial transactions always have when conducted through a small aperture in a wall. The booking clerk knew the timetable. He knew the fares. He knew the connections. He was, in a sense, the intelligence of the station, the person who could tell you what you needed to know about your journey, though his manner in delivering this information might be anything from briskly helpful to magnificently indifferent, depending on the specific clerk and the specific day. The refreshment room, The Victorian station refreshment room is one of the great institutions of the era, and like most Victorian institutions, it was complex in ways that the surface doesn't reveal. The refreshment room existed to feed travellers on long journeys. Before dining cars, the refreshment room at a major junction was where you went when the train stopped and you had 15 minutes in which to eat or drink something before the train left without you. The good refreshment rooms were excellent. Tea, coffee, substantial sandwiches, pies, occasionally something approaching a proper meal. The bad ones were the subject of Victorian complaint literature going back to the earliest days of the railway. Dickens hated railway refreshment rooms. Specifically, he hated the quality of the refreshments and the manner of the women who served them, whom he caricatured with some venom in a piece called Marlworth Junction, published in 1866, in which the narrator encounters at a railway junction a refreshment room staffed by women of supernatural unhelpfulness who make deliberately terrible refreshments and serve them with an air of serene indifference to customer satisfaction. The piece is exaggerated for comic effect, but it captured a real complaint that the refreshment rooms on some lines were not good, and that the railway companies, having often awarded refreshment room concessions to operators who were willing to pay for the privilege rather than operators who were willing to provide good food, had created a situation where the captive traveller was being served badly. This was not universal. The great junctions on the prestige routes had prestige refreshment rooms. The Midland Railway's refreshment facilities at some of its major stations were renowned. The competition between companies extended to the quality of their station facilities as well as to the speed of their trains. But the Dickensian complaint had enough truth in it to sting. Tonight you've had dinner in the dining car, as I mentioned, and you haven't needed the refreshment room. But knowing it's there is part of the fabric of the journey. Let me come back to the window one more time. The window in the dark. There is something I've been circling around all evening that I want to name directly, because I think it's the real subject of tonight's story. The experience of being on a long train journey at night, in a warm and enclosed space, moving through a dark world that is visible through the window only in glimpses and shapes, is an experience that is close to the experience of being between states. Not quite asleep, not quite awake, not quite in one place, not quite in another, moving from somewhere to somewhere, belonging for the duration of the journey to neither. The Victorians felt this too. The railway journey, particularly the night journey, generated in travellers a distinctive state that the literature of the era tries, with varying success, to describe. It's not sleep, but it has qualities of sleep. It's not waking, but it has qualities of waking. The window is a strange portal. You can see through it, but you can't enter what you see. The landscape moves, but you don't move. You're still, and the world is in motion. John Ruskin, who hated railways as technology and what they were doing to the English landscape, nevertheless captured something real about the experience of train travel when he complained that one arrived somewhere without the experience of having travelled there. In a coach, you moved through the landscape at a pace that allowed you to observe it, to feel your relationship to it change gradually. You knew what was between here and there because you had been through it. On a train, you were projected from one place to another without the connecting tissue. You arrived at your destination without having truly passed through the miles between. This was the complaint, and it's not wrong as a description of something that really happened. Train travel does disconnect the traveller from the landscape in a way that slower travel doesn't, but Ruskin was missing something in his complaint, which is that the disconnection produced its own experience, its own way of being in the world. The railway traveller in the window is not having no experience. They're having a specific experience, the experience of the moving world as spectacle, of landscape as something that presents itself and then withdraws, of oneself as a witness passing through a world that has been arranged by the motion and the window into a kind of moving painting. George Eliot found the railway journey a useful image for certain kinds of thought, the experience of being in motion, of having left one place and not yet arrived at another. She uses in several places as a way of describing the mental state of a character in transition, in between states of certainty. The train journey as metaphor for the liminal. But it's not only a metaphor, it's also the thing itself. The train journey at night, the window showing darkness and glimpses, the wheel sound and the warmth, these are an experience. They produce something in you. Something that is partly rest, partly thought, partly a specific quality of attention that is different from most other qualities of attention in your daily life. That quality of attention is the one I've been trying to describe all evening. The unhurried, slightly unfocused, open receptivity to whatever the window offers, not pursuing, not analyzing, just watching, being, letting the world go by. This is, I would argue, a form of rest. Not sleep, but close to it. The body is still. The nervous system is not being asked for anything particular. The mind is engaged but gently, without urgency. This is the state that the train cultivates, the state that makes falling asleep on a train not just possible, but almost inevitable after long enough. If you haven't quite fallen asleep yet, if you're still with me, still in the compartment, still watching the darkness, then you're in this state now, or very close to it. The wheel sound is there, the warmth is there, the slight sway is there. Your coat is folded beside you and your bag is in the rack and the journey is nearly over. And the thing that remains before arrival is this, exactly this. The warmth and the sound and the dark window and the growing acceptance that consciousness is optional tonight, that you have permission to let go. Let me stay with you for a little longer. Let me tell you more. The Victorian medical establishment, and by the 1880s this is a substantial and organised establishment, with its royal colleges and its hospitals and its developing understanding of physiology and disease that is moving slowly toward the germ theory that Pasteur and Koch were demonstrating in these exact years, had opinions about sleep. Strong, numerous, sometimes contradictory opinions. Sleep was understood as a physiological necessity. This was not quite as obvious as it might seem. The exact mechanisms of sleep, why it was necessary, what it accomplished in the body and mind, were not well understood even in the 1880s. What was understood was observational. People who didn't sleep enough performed badly, declined in health, became irritable and irrational, and eventually, in extreme cases, died. The inference was that sleep did something necessary. What exactly it did was debated. The nervous exhaustion model was influential in the Victorian era. The idea, associated with the American neurologist George Beard and his 1869 coinage of the term neurasthenia, was that modern life, the pace, the stimulation, the demands of urban industrial civilization, was exhausting the nervous system in ways that sleep was supposed to but sometimes failed to repair. The Victorian was prone to nervous exhaustion in this model because the Victorian lived in an unprecedented environment of stimulation and demand. The telegraph, the newspaper, the railway, Beard specifically mentioned the railway, created pressures on the nervous system that the nervous system had not evolved to handle efficiently. This generated enormous quantities of medical advice about the proper conditions for sleep, ventilated bedrooms, appropriate bedding, the right time of retiring and the right time of rising, the right kind of diet for promoting healthy sleep, the right kind of mental activity in the hours before sleep, which emphatically did not include stimulating novels or disturbing news. The wrong kind, which included too much intellectual work late in the day, too much rich food, too much alcohol, any of the coffee or tea that the Victorians were consuming in increasing quantities. The sleep advice was earnest and voluminous and not always accurate. Some of it was genuinely useful. The well-ventilated bedroom recommendation, for instance, aligns with what modern sleep science knows about the relationship between air quality and sleep quality. Some of it was the product of social anxiety rather than physiology. The concern about the nervous excitation produced by sensation novels, for instance, was partly about sleep and partly about the unsettling effects that novels about adultery and crime were thought to produce in female readers. But the underlying recognition was right. Sleep is important, rest is necessary, and the conditions in which they happen matter. The Victorians were anxious about sleep because they were anxious about everything. But their anxiety was not unfounded. The railway contributed to this anxiety. The railway, as Beard noted, was a source of stimulation, of speed, of the nervous demands of modern life. But the railway was also, paradoxically, a place where sleep often arrived of its own accord. The railway journey, particularly a long one, could produce sleep in people who had been unable to sleep in their own beds at home. The motion and the sound and the warmth and the enclosure did what all the advice about ventilated bedrooms and appropriate diets had failed to accomplish. This was noted, it was discussed. There was some debate about whether railway sleep was good sleep, whether the motion and the noise prevented the deepest stages of rest. But the consensus, or at least the popular consensus that I see in the travel literature, was that it was real sleep, genuine rest, that arriving after a night train feeling better than you'd gotten on was not unusual. The body knew something the medical establishment was still working out. Let me tell you about one more thing before we arrive. I want to tell you about the other kinds of people who travelled on Victorian railways, because the first-class compartment is not the whole story and I don't want to leave you with a partial picture. The third-class carriages were a world of their own. Initially, and I mean in the 1830s and early 1840s, third-class travel on many railways was genuinely brutal. Open wagons, no seats in some cases, passengers standing or sitting on the floor, exposed to wind and rain and the sparks from the locomotive ahead. The Gladstone Act of 1844, sometimes called the Parliamentary Trains Act, required railway companies to run at least one train per day on each of their lines with third-class enclosed carriages at a fare of no more than 1 penny per mile. This established the legal minimum. Many companies did more than the minimum over time, as competition for the working-class market grew and as the social politics of the railway became more visible. By the 1880s, third-class carriages on most mainline railways were enclosed, seated, tolerable. Not comfortable in the first-class sense, but tolerable. The people who travelled third class were the majority of railway passengers. The factory workers and the domestic servants and the farmers and the shop assistants and the craftspeople and everyone else for whom a ticket was a considered expense rather than an afterthought. They travelled with less luggage and fewer formalities and in more crowded carriages, and their relationship with the railway was different from the first-class travellers' relationship in ways that are worth being specific about. First, economically. The third-class passenger was making a calculation with every journey. Could she afford this? Was the journey worth the cost? The first-class passenger for whom this journey is a professional expense or an ordinary personal indulgence made no such calculation. The third-class passenger did, and the railway companies knew this and used it, setting third-class fares at levels that were accessible to working-class budgets without being so low as to undermine the revenue model that depended on middle and upper-class passengers paying significantly more for better conditions. Second, in terms of purpose. The first-class traveller was often travelling for business or for pleasure, or for the kind of extended visits to relations that were a feature of upper and middle-class Victorian social life. The third-class traveller was often travelling for necessity, to find work, to visit family in a time of illness, to move goods to market. The urgency of the third-class journey was often higher, the margins tighter, the consequences of a missed connection more severe. Third, in terms of experience. The third-class compartment in the 1880s was louder, more crowded, less private, less comfortable. The upholstery was harder or absent. The windows might not open as smoothly. The temperature was less managed. The journey was the same miles, the same English countryside going by, the same October night, but experienced from a position of less physical comfort and less social cushioning. And yet there are accounts in the travel literature and the journalism of the era that suggest that third-class carriages had their own social richness. The enforced proximity produced a kind of community that the first-class compartment, with its silences and its averted gazes, deliberately prevented. People talked in third-class carriages, they shared food, they helped each other with children and luggage. The class constraints that made the first-class compartment a performance of restraint were less present or differently present in a carriage where the passengers had less to prove. I don't want to romanticize hardship. Third-class travel was worse than first-class travel by any material measure, and the people who travelled third class would, given the choice and the means, have travelled first class. The class system of the Victorian railways was not an expression of social wisdom. It was an expression of social hierarchy, of the fact that some people could pay more and others couldn't, and that the railway had decided to make the most of this fact. The parliamentary minimum was imposed precisely because the market left to itself had produced conditions that even a Victorian Parliament found unacceptable. But the third-class carriage was not a space of pure deprivation either. It was a space of ordinary human life, of people with purposes going somewhere they needed to go, of the particular resilience that comes with not having the option to be precious about conditions. The whole train is carrying all of these people, tonight, through the October dark. You in your first-class compartment with your velvet seat and your dimmed gas lamp, the commercial traveller in his second-class compartment with his briefcase and his newspaper, already asleep in the corner with his hat over his face, the family in third class, children finally still, parents leaning into each other with the exhausted tenderness of people who have been managing all day and can finally rest for a moment, all of you moving through the same night, through the same dark countryside, toward your various destinations. There's something beautiful about that, I think. The train as temporary community, a cross-section of Victorian England moving together through the dark, each person in their own world, but all in the same world too, all on the same iron road going the same direction, all subject to the same motion and the same sound and the same October. Let me tell you about the locomotives' names. Victorian locomotives were often named, not just numbered, named after places, after historical figures, after natural phenomena, after abstract virtues, after whatever the naming committee or the locomotive superintendent found appropriate or inspiring. The Great Western Railway had a long tradition of naming its locomotives after classical allusions and medieval knights. Iron Duke, Titan, Achilles, Agamemnon. The London and North Western had precedent-class engines named after statesmen and poets. The Midland had its own traditions. The names gave the locomotives personalities, made them knowable as individuals rather than interchangeable machines. This mattered to the people who worked with them. The driver who had driven the same engine for years developed something like a relationship with it. Not sentimentally. These were hard-headed working men with little patience for sentimentality, but practically, he knew its particular voice. He knew how it sounded when it was running well, and how it sounded when something was wrong. He knew its tendencies, its preferences, its weaknesses. This knowledge made him a better driver of that particular engine, in the same way that knowing an instrument makes you a better musician. The names also mattered to the passengers in a different way. The knowledge that you were travelling behind Achilles or Titan or Duchess of something gave the journey a slight quality of drama, of having been placed in the hands of something large and named, rather than merely something large. The nominal personality of the locomotive extended the railway company's brand into the specific experience of specific journeys. What's at the front of your train tonight? I'm going to say it's called something with dignity and assurance. Orion, perhaps? Or Comet? Or something that suggests speed and power and reliability, which is exactly what you want at the front of the train that's carrying you through the October dark. Orion is doing his job out there. You can't see him from your compartment. The locomotive is far ahead, and the night is dark, and the curve of the line means that even if you pressed your face to the window and looked forward, you'd see only the dark shape of the train's length against the darker shape of the world. But he's there, doing the work, the steam pressure maintained, the speed appropriate to the track, the fire burning at the rate the fireman is managing it. The driver knows this particular stretch of track. He's driven it dozens of times, maybe hundreds. He knows where the gentle curve is coming in about 3 miles, knows to take the throttle back slightly for it, knows that after the curve there's a straight section where the track is good and he can let the speed build back up. He knows this in his body, not just in his head. The knowledge is in his hands on the controls and his feet on the footplate and his eyes scanning the signals ahead. You're in safe hands. You've always been in safe hands. The hands are just very far away from where you're sitting. Let me tell you about the darkness outside the window one more time, because the darkness is different now than it was an hour ago. Earlier it was early darkness, the darkness of a night that had just arrived, still with the last traces of daylight somewhere in its periphery, still with the occasional farm window burning bright. Now it's deep darkness. The darkness of 11 o'clock in the English countryside in October, when the farms are dark because the farmers have gone to bed and the roads are empty and the sky is what it is, which is either full of stars if it's clear, or an even, deep, featureless dark if it's clouded. Tonight it's clouded. You can tell because there's no starlight, no faint differentiation between sky and horizon. The darkness outside the window is essentially uniform, with occasional punctuation, a signal lamp, green or red against the black, the gleam of a wet rail in the darkness as you pass through a station at speed without stopping. Once, a minute ago, a single lit window in a farmhouse so far from the line that it appeared and disappeared like a thought. These are your companions, these lights in the dark. The world is asleep or sleeping toward sleep, and you are moving through the middle of it, warm and enclosed, and the lights are the world's acknowledgement that you're passing. Here is something I find genuinely moving about the Victorian night train in the countryside. The train is visible. From outside, from the farmhouse or the road or the field, the train at night is a moving light, a sequence of lit windows going past. Someone standing in a field at this moment, unable to sleep, getting up to look out a window at the strange clear dark, would see your train go by, a constellation of warm orange rectangles moving through the dark at 60 miles an hour and then gone, the sound of it fading over the course of a minute into silence. You are visible from the outside as a kind of wonder, a warm and moving thing in a dark and still world. You don't know this about yourself. From inside the compartment, you can see only the dark outside, the mirror of the lamp in the window, your own face reflected, but from outside you are a spectacle, a brief and luminous one. I think about this with other people sometimes, how we are, from angles we can't see ourselves from, something more visible and more interesting than we know. You are a lit window moving through the dark. From the right angle, from the outside, you are the warm thing in the cold world, the moving thing in the still world, the lit thing in the dark. The train is slowing again. No, not slowing, something else. A change in the quality of the motion. The track is different here, the joins more frequent perhaps, or the grade has changed. The rhythm of the wheels acquires a slightly different emphasis, a different arrangement of the beats. Dadum becomes something more complicated for a moment, the wheels negotiating a junction or a crossover, and then resolves back into the steady pulse. This is nothing. This is the railway doing what the railway does. The driver knows. The train knows. You can let go of the slight alertness the change produced. Let go. Let go of it. Your eyes are closing, or if they've been closed for a while, they're staying closed. There's no particular moment when this happened, no threshold you crossed. It's more like a gradient, a slow and comfortable slide from one state toward another. And you're somewhere on that gradient now, somewhere between the compartment and the darkness behind your eyes, between the sound of the wheels and the sound of your own breathing, between the weight of your body in the velvet seat and the lightness that sleep starts to bring. Let me stay with you for a little longer. Let me keep telling you things quietly, the way you keep a fire going, not because you need the warmth right now, but because the warmth is good and the fire is there. The Victorian railway era produced writers, not just writers who happened to use trains as settings, but writers who were shaped by the experience of rail travel in specific ways. Dickens most obviously. Dickens travelled by train constantly. He was one of the great travellers of his era, crisscrossing England on reading tours and editorial business and visits to friends, and his relationship with the railway was complicated by the fact that he was involved in a serious railway accident in June 1865 at Staplehurst in Kent, where a derailment killed 10 people and injured many more, and Dickens himself was in a carriage that ended up hanging over a streambed supported only by a broken bridge. He climbed out, helped the injured and dying, retrieved the manuscript of Our Mutual Friend from his carriage before it fell, and continued to use trains for the remaining 5 years of his life, though with considerable residual anxiety. His writing after Staplehurst has moments where the railway appears with a quality of darkness not present before it. The machinery that was purely exciting in Dombey and Son, written in the 1840s, the famous passage about the locomotive as a death-dealing force sweeping through the landscape, becomes something that carries personal memory as well as cultural weight. Thomas Hardy travelled by train through Dorset and used railway journeys as structural elements in several of his novels, moments of transition and departure that carry weight in the narratives because they carry weight in the lives of the characters for whom they represent, sometimes escape, sometimes exile, sometimes the point of no return from which the tragedy will unfold. The railway in Hardy is often a place where decisions are made irreversible, where one gets on and cannot not get off where one was going. Anthony Trollope was a champion of writing on trains. He reportedly wrote 3,000 words per day on railway journeys, propping a writing board on his knees, keeping his ink and pen organized with the practiced skill of someone who has done this in all conditions including motion, and producing pages of his enormous novels in the intervals between appointments and visits, and the various social obligations of a man who was simultaneously a post office official and one of the most prolific novelists of his age. The train gave him time. It gave him the particular quality of creative focus that can come from being enclosed and in motion, cut off from the ordinary demands of the domestic world, carried from A to B with nothing to do but what you've decided to do. In a sense, the railway gave Trollope his career, or a significant part of it. The books would have been written anyway, perhaps. Trollope was compulsively productive, but the railway gave the writing regular, uninterrupted blocks of time in a way that the demands of Victorian professional and social life otherwise would not have allowed. I think about this when I think about the nature of creative work and the conditions that help it happen. The train, with its enforced idleness and its gentle motion and its separation from ordinary life, created space, not just physical space, though a railway compartment is a room, a private room for the duration of the journey, but temporal and psychological space. You are going somewhere, and you won't be there for several hours, and in those hours you are in a meaningful sense off the hook. The demands of your destination can't reach you yet. The demands of your origin are behind you. You are in the middle, and the middle belongs to you. This is genuinely valuable, and it's something that modern travel, with its Wi-Fi and its devices and the permanent accessibility they enable, has partially but not entirely taken away. There is still, on some trains, on some journeys, a version of Trollope's middle. There is still the possibility of closing the laptop, putting away the phone, watching the window, and letting the middle be what it is. Tonight you're in the full Victorian version of it. No devices, no connectivity, nothing to do but be in the compartment and watch the dark window and let the sound of the wheels do its patient work. The wheels are doing their patient work. Dadum? Dadum? Let me tell you one more thing. One more quiet thing. The railway landscape of Victorian England is not the natural landscape. It's a made landscape, a human landscape imposed on the natural one, and the making of it was enormously consequential for the places it went through. But the railway landscape is also now, in 1882, 50 years after the first passenger railways, beginning to feel like a natural landscape. The cuts and embankments have grown their vegetation, the wild flowers colonized the slope below the chalk cutting. The buddleia that would become the signature plant of railway infrastructure hasn't quite arrived yet. That's a 20th century story. But the brambles have, and the willow herb, and the elder, and all the other plants that find in the disturbed ground of railway earthworks exactly the conditions they prefer. The birds have discovered the thermal effects of the railway. The fox has discovered that the embankment is a dry and sheltered place to establish its den. The railway is being absorbed into the landscape, slowly, plant by plant, year by year. In 50 more years it will be indistinguishable in some stretches from the land around it. The embankment as much a natural feature of the countryside as the hedgerow beside it. In 150 years, when some of the lines have been closed and the tracks removed and the corridors left to themselves, the wildlife will have made them into something altogether new. The railway as ecological corridor, a long, thin nature reserve, connecting habitats that the agricultural transformation of the 20th century would otherwise have isolated from each other. All of that is in the future. Tonight, in 1882, the railway is still new enough to be remarkable, still close enough to its beginning to carry the traces of its construction in the raw edges of some of its cuttings, the bright newness of some of its brickwork, but it is already showing what it will become. The natural world is already beginning the long process of making it its own. Outside your window, if you looked, if the darkness allowed, you'd see the embankment's slope running down into the field. You'd see the edge of the managed railway right-of-way giving way to the ordinary countryside. You'd see the place where the railway's world meets the world it passes through. But the darkness doesn't allow tonight. The window shows you nothing but darkness and your own reflection. The compartment exists in itself, sealed from the world it's moving through. You are somewhere between Marlworth Junction and your destination, somewhere in the middle of an October night in the English countryside, and the world outside is doing its things without you. Let it do its things. Let the wheel sound be what it is. Let the warmth be what it is. Let the small sway of the carriage be what it is. You've been on this train for hours. The journey is nearly over. The station is coming, somewhere ahead in the dark, and the train knows the way there, and the driver knows the way there, and all you have to do between now and arriving is rest. Rest. Actually rest. Not the restlessness of trying to rest. Not the performance of rest with the mind still running its commentary underneath. Just the actual thing. The body in the seat, the breath moving in and out, the eyes shut or very nearly shut, the mind letting go of its grip on the evening and the day and all the things that were supposed to be thought about and decided and managed. Not now. Not tonight. Tonight the train is handling it. The rhythm of the wheels is very constant now, very patient. It's been this way for hours, and it will be this way until you arrive, and it doesn't need you to do anything about it. It just needs you to receive it. Dadum, dadum, there is a particular quality of sleep that comes after a long journey. Not the brick wall sleep of complete exhaustion, which is its own thing and not always restorative. Not the fitful surface sleep of anxiety or pain. The sleep that comes after a long train journey on an autumn evening has a quality of arrival about it. You've been in motion for hours and now you're still, or about to be still, and the stillness feels like something you've earned, like a place you've travelled toward. Sleep is a destination. It's where you're going tonight, after the train, after the station, after whatever comes next. The bed, your hotel bed, or your own bed if you're home, or the comfortable bed in your friend's guest room, is already there, already made, already waiting to receive you, and the train is bringing you to it, and the journey itself has been preparing you for it, dissolving the day's tensions in hours of motion and warmth, and the rhythmic company of the wheels. You're nearly there. You're nearly at both destinations, the station where you'll get off, and the sleep that's waiting afterward. But for now, for these last few minutes, you're still in the compartment, still on the train, still in the warm, dark world of the railway carriage with its velvet seat and its gas lamp and its slightly imperfect window, showing you nothing but your own reflection, and the occasional gleam of a signal lamp in the passing dark. Let me stay with you until you don't need me anymore. The Victorian railway carried the empire. It carried the mail and the troops and the coal and the cotton and the timber and the grain and the ministers of Parliament and the Queen herself, who had her own royal train fitted out with extraordinary care, and used it for the first time in 1842 and thereafter with increasing regularity, becoming one of the most travelled monarchs in British history on the back of the technology that her era had produced. The railway was the infrastructure of everything the Victorian age accomplished, for good and ill, and understanding the Victorian age requires understanding the railway that ran through it. But the railway also carried this, the ordinary evening service, the third-class family with the sleeping children, the commercial traveller in the corner, the retired officer with his country house invitation, you in your first-class compartment with your coat and your bag and your window onto the dark English countryside. It carried the private lives, the quiet journeys, the falling asleep and the waking up and the watching the window and the thinking about nothing in particular and the arriving somewhere and the being glad to arrive. The great machinery of Victorian England made room for this too, for the hours between departure and arrival that belonged to no purpose except the journey itself, for the particular gift of motion without responsibility, of being carried without having to drive. This is what the train gives you finally, what it gave the Victorian traveller and gives you now, in whatever form your own journey takes, the gift of being carried, of trusting the mechanism, of letting go of the steering. You're on a train, someone else is driving, the direction is fixed, the destination is known. All you have to do is rest. Da-dum, da-dum. The carriage sways gently as it's been swaying all evening. The gas lamp has settled to its warm, low glow. The coat is still folded beside you. The bag is still in the rack overhead. The world outside the window is dark and moving, and you don't have to look at it anymore if you don't want to. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. The sound of the wheels is constant, and it will be constant until you arrive. And arriving is not your problem to solve. The train knows where it's going. Let it take you there. The signal lamp went by a moment ago. Green in the darkness. Green means proceed. Green means the way is clear and you can continue, can keep moving toward where you're going, can let the momentum carry you the rest of the way. The way is clear. Proceed. The darkness outside the window is not the darkness of absence, but the darkness of presence. The whole English countryside in its October night. The fields asleep under their frost. The foxes moving along their hedgerow paths. The owls working their silent grid, the stars above the clouds going about their business of being very far away and very bright. All of it out there, real, continuing, and you in here, warm and enclosed, being carried through the middle of it. There are lights ahead, somewhere, the edge of where you're going. The station is out there in the dark, getting closer with every revolution of the wheels, and the driver knows this, and the train knows this, and soon the brakes will begin their gentle work, and the platform will appear, and the journey will complete itself. But not quite yet, not yet. For now there's only the dark and the warmth and the sound and the sway, and all of it asking you for nothing at all. Just your presence, just your breathing, just the weight of your body in the seat, which the velvet will hold for as long as you need it to. Sleep well. The train is taking you somewhere safe. The train has always been taking you somewhere safe. Da-dum, da-dum. Close your eyes and let the wheels do their work. You're almost there. You're already there. The journey is over. Sleep now.